This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today marks the start of something a little bit special. During this September and October, I will be releasing a series of episodes on what has been many times called the most complicated thing in the universe, the human brain. You're going to hear from everything from the history of neuroscience to the wonders and the troubles occurring in the hospital wards of neurologists. But to kick things off, I'm going to have 2 episodes on the evolution of the human brain. Next week, you're going to hear from a familiar voice, Dean Falk, who I had on to talk about human evolution in general, but she's going to be back on a fresh episode on the evolution of the human brain in particular, which is her expertise. But that conversation with Falk is very much kind of dialogue with an earlier conversation that I had with the Brazilian neuroscientist Suzana Herculano-Houzel, who I had on 2 years ago, and whose episode I therefore decided to release here as a kind of prologue on what is to come. The conversation has been remastered and re-edited. By listening to this, not only will you get a sense of what's at stake on this debate between the 2 neuroscientists, who in some ways complement each other, but in other ways do actually disagree with each other, but you're also going to hear one of the simplest, most powerful, most elegant stories that I have ever heard about the origins of the human brain, and about the ways in which we are both unique and in some ways just a continuation of the endless forms most beautiful that we find in the natural world. I hope that you enjoy this full series, and I hope that you enjoy this prologue with Suzana Herculano-Houzel. If you do, as always, you can hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so yet. You can give the show a 5-star review on your podcast app if you feel that I deserve it. And of course, you can share the episode forward with anyone you think might also enjoy it. Finally, thank you so much to the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Your contributions make this work possible. And as always, this episode is for you. Now let's go. Professor Suzana Herculano-Houzel, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I have long known that the human brain is a biological anomaly. It is way too big. And it's also completely abnormally shaped so that it has extended towards the frontal area so that we have this massive frontal cortex compared to other animals. How wrong have I been?
Completely. But in very good company, because that's what everybody used to think for the longest time. You know, the human brain is special. And I understand the allure in thinking that human brains must be special, that humans as a species must be special, because we are pretty comfortable with the idea that it's brains that produce the mind and thoughts and, all these beautifully complex things that we do. And yet we don't have the biggest brain around.
Who has the biggest brain?
Blue whales, maybe the humpback. Some gigantic whale has a brain that's about 9 kilograms, and ours is 1.5.
Okay.
So even an elephant has a brain that's, the size of my entire forearm. That's 3 times the size of our brain. And yet we study elephants and not the other way around, as far as we know. So how does one account for that? If our brain is not the biggest, then our brain must be the best, right? It must be better in some way. And that's where all the claims to exceptionality begin. And so this has been a long-standing mystery, if you will. How come we don't have the biggest brain, and yet we're the ones who built this super complex civilization, and we're the ones studying everybody else? And which is why when this paleontologist, Harry Jerrison, pointed out that relative to the size of our body, human brains are, as you said, too large, 7 times the size that you would expect for a generic mammal of our size. That seemed to finally settle the question. It was the first time that there was a reasonable answer to the question of how come humans are all that.
And when was this? I'm curious.
1973.
73. Okay. So oil crisis and evolution of intelligence.
Yeah. So, but it was a longstanding question, right? But unresolved one. So, what Jerrison did was point out that well, there was this well-known relationship between the size of the body and the size of the brain, which makes perfect intuitive sense. The bigger an animal is, the bigger its brain is, right? Seems just about right. Jerrison reasoned that, well, if bigger animals have bigger brains, it's because they must need to have bigger brains. He also assumed, Jerrison acknowledged already that the thing that we should really be looking at is numbers of neurons.
Which makes perfect sense. I mean, in the computer era.
Makes perfect sense.
It's not the biggest computer; it's the chips with the most transistors or whatever.
Right? We've learned that much already. That it doesn't matter the size of the box containing all those units. What you really care about is the number of information processing, the signal processing units.
And so, just to take stock, what you would agree with him that the amount of neurons does matter. That's for sure, and I guess
absolutely.
And we would also, I guess, everybody agrees that if we just look at human evolution, say the last 7 million, 4 million, 2 million years, what we do see is a large increase in brain size.
Absolutely. If you look at absolute brain size, you see the absolute size of our ancestors triple over the last 2 million years, which is absolutely remarkable.
Yeah. So there are seeds of truth in this story. Yeah. So where exactly do we face the problems?
So there's a few huge problems, and the problems, as could be expected, they lie in the assumptions that Jerrison had to make. So there's two huge assumptions that needed to be true, and I could show that neither of them is true. Assumption number one is that bigger animals do need more neurons to run their bodies. Assumption number two is that bigger brains always have more neurons than smaller brains, which translates into, if you have two brains of a similar size, they're going to be made of similar numbers of neurons, right? So turns out that neither one of those things is true. So where can we begin? Let's start with the second one, that brains of a similar size have similar numbers of neurons. Once I realized that was an assumption, that was a very, very widespread assumption, that everybody in the field seemed to be working with that assumption. So
they would say that it is what, at the end of the day, what matters is neurons, but we don't need to worry about them because we can just guess that if a brain is bigger than another brain, it will have more neurons.
Correct. And so the reason why that assumption was necessary was that we didn't have the means to count neurons, not in a way that was practical enough, rapid enough for handling whole brains. And that is exactly what I realized that I could do. I could literally transform brains into soup. And when you do that, the beauty of the soup is that those cells that were once organized in very, very particular ways, making up the different parts of a brain, now they're just spread out pretty evenly, pretty homogeneously in that liquid, right? And because it's a liquid, you can keep it homogeneous just by agitating it. Just mix the soup before you eat it, so you make sure that you don't have any deposits as the bottom of your bowl, and then take any 4 samples out of that homogeneous soup under your microscope, and in a matter of 15 minutes, you have a full count. So that's what I figured I could do, and that's what I started doing about 20 years ago.
And now we know the
pretty much the amount of neurons that different, at least mammals have, right?
Not only mammals, we have birds, through my network of collaborators in different countries, we're right now at 267 species and growing.
You say in your book that human brain is remarkable, but not special. So it's not special in the way that traditionally people might have said that, oh, it's just way too big in every way, or that it's weirdly shaped or something. We actually didn't touch upon that, but am I right that if you look at the percentage of these frontal areas, for example, or the way that they connect to others, is pretty similar?
Correct. Or a cortex has the number of neurons that you would expect for a primate.
Okay, and I guess this then takes us to what you call the primate advantage. So what is the primate advantage?
The primate advantage compared to other mammals is simply that because of the way primate brains are made of, you find a very large number of neurons in a brain that is pretty small compared to other animals. Like I said, a giraffe is a non-primate with a similar number of neurons in the cortex as a macaque, and the macaque cortex is about 100 grams. The giraffe cortex is 400 grams or so.
Okay, so the primate brain is able to pack more neurons to a small brain. Does the primate brain add more neurons as it scales? Is it faster at scaling as it grows bigger?
Correct. While other animals have their brain size become much larger as they gain neurons, in primates, the two things happen at the same pace.
Okay.
So a primate with 10 times more neurons only has a 10 times bigger brain. A non-primate with 10 times the neurons has a 40 times bigger brain.
And here comes the gist, which I think is perhaps the most crucial finding, or correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, when I was, for example, reading through Human Advantage, and already back in the days when I first saw your TED Talk, the one thing that I remember taking away was that when you plot small primates, small monkeys basically, on a graph, predicting how big they are and how many neurons they are, and you just draw a line, humans are right on that line.
Humans are right on the line. So let me put this in numbers that are meaningful to the listeners. Our brain is about 2% of the size of the body.
Yeah.
The brain of most other primate species is also about 2% of the size of their bodies. I mean, the proportion of our between our head and the rest of our body is the same proportion that you recognize in small monkeys. The outliers here is the great apes.
Yeah, like gorillas and chimpanzees.
So they have these gigantic bodies, but not the brain size that you would expect for their bodies. But I think there's a very, very good and simple explanation for that, is that they've reached the limit of how much energy that's going to cost them. It's very costly to run a bigger body. And great apes, with the big body that they have to eat over 8 hours per day. They eat 8.5 hours per day, which evidence shows that in practice, they're at their limit. They cannot eat any more than that. They've reached the wall. They're right there.
And our ancestors must have been there too, but somehow, and I know you have an answer to what's the somehow, they were able to unlock this kind of realm of having not the same energy constraints. And suddenly they become another normal, quote unquote, normal generic primate again with the kind of brain.
Let me put it this way, Ilari, that our ancestors developed a cheat. And the cheat is that we have a means to absorb more energy from the foods that we put in our mouths. And that's called pre-processing or pre-digesting your food, or let me put it in the blunt but very effective way of phrasing this. Our food is pre-chewed before we put it in our mouths. And that is what cooking is. And I don't mean necessarily cooking, this pre-digestion, this pre-chewing of the food that we eat. Of course, it can be done extraordinarily well with fire, which also makes foods delicious, right? But you don't need fire to cook your foods in the sense of pre-digesting, of pre-chewing your food.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of raw diets are based on things like blenders, a lot of blending, etc.
Which is cooking,
Pre-digestion,
right?
Yeah,
it's a different type of cooking, and that's what you had with the first human technology. I like to think of as stone tools. Stone tools were these artifacts that, whether you have the means to fashion them, to craft them yourself, or you just use stones as they come, which, by the way, is something that a number of monkeys know to do. When you use a stone to pound your food, to pound seeds, to crush roots, you are literally pre-chewing. You're using the stone to chew your food before you put it in your mouth.
and so this is the human story short. Then is that we are a primate, and primates have this, to be a mammal, this very unique brain design that can pack a lot of neurons into a brain, and especially as the brain grows, you can keep adding a lot of neurons into that brain, which would predict, you say, that if you would have a primate of our size, you would have the brain of our size. Now, all the other big primates cannot have that big of a brain because they would have to be eating 10, 12 hours a day to feed, to have enough calories. And we don't, because we cook.
Exactly. So it took me a while to decide what word I wanted to use to qualify human brains. So remarkable means noteworthy, right? And we are remarkable in that we are the species that has the most neurons in the cerebral cortex. Even though we don't have the biggest brain, we don't have the biggest body.
And importantly, this is not most neurons compared to body size or anything like that. It's just in absolute terms, most neurons.
This is absolute number of neurons, absolute number of neurons.
What is the cerebral cortex for those who, because we're not, just to be clear, we're not talking about the absolute amount of neurons in the brain. We're talking about the cerebral cortex. So maybe it would be useful to have the neuroscientist here explain quickly what is the cerebral cortex.
So here's my short take on what a cerebral cortex is and why do we care so much about how many neurons you have in the cerebral cortex. Technically, the brain doesn't need a cerebral cortex. The body doesn't need a cerebral cortex. All the parts of the brain that operate the body, that run your basic functions, that even move your body, they're not in the cortex. They live in the other, let's go with lower, just physically lower parts of your brain. All the parts of the brain that are not cerebellum and not cerebral cortex. Those are the parts. Those are the structures that are made by neurons that both command the body and receive feedback from the body. The point is, the cerebral cortex literally saddles the rest of the brain, as in it sets atop exactly like a saddle on a horse. I like the horse analogy because a horse can function without a saddle, right? Of course it can. The horse is its own thing. But once you have a saddle on top of the horse, you have the means to direct, you have the means to organize, you have this added layer of complexity to the horse behavior, right? And that's the exact same thing to a brain that has a cortex. So you don't need the cortex, but once you have it saddling the brain, you have the possibility for much more complex and flexible behavior. And that is because what the cortex is is this structure that receives copies of everything that's going on in the other parts of the brain. Actually, the cerebellum does the same thing. There are two saddles on the rest of on the trunk of the brain. Let's put it that way. So they receive, both cerebral cortex and cerebellum, they both receive copies of everything that goes on in the trunk of the brain. And more than that, and especially the cerebral cortex, it has these horizontal connectivities, and horizontal simply means that it talks to itself. The cortex has a lot of the neurons in the cortex. They simply talk to each other. They exchange signals. They build information together. It means that the cortex is capable of putting things together that the rest of the brain can't do, just because it doesn't have the connections that allow it.
And hence the links to whatever reasoning, thinking, perhaps consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah, but let's keep it basics. The cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that has the capability for building patterns, for building associations, for finding associations between your action and something else that happened out there, right? It gets copies of all the signals. It puts those signals together. It creates new associations. It finds patterns. It finds patterns in the past. It can use those patterns to simulate what next. So it can start representing a future. It can represent, this cortex can represent things that are not available to your senses anymore, right? It can keep all these ideas active. It can keep all these representations active. And it can make you act. It can modify your actions. It can modify your body and how you feel and what you do based not only on what is actually going on right now, but also on what you expect to happen first or to happen next. Or even more, you can start acting now towards futures that haven't happened yet, but that you can foresee, that you can anticipate, that you can desire, and that you can then, now that you have a cortex settling the rest of your brain, you can act upon and make happen.
And I think that's actually very important, because those are things that too often people might say that these are uniquely human things. And what you're saying is that, well, no, but there is a certain intuition preserved from the fact that we have more neurons in cortex than any other species. Yes, perhaps we are better at doing mental time travel, etc.
So let me put that in context. Our 16 billion neurons is twice the number of cortical neurons in the next species, which are gorillas and orangutans.
Wait, do gorillas and orangutans have more than chimpanzees?
Yes, they do. Chimpanzees have 6 to 7 billion neurons in the cortex.
Interesting. Okay.
So after chimpanzees, you have elephants with 5 to 6 billion. Then you have, we estimate all the whales, dolphins and whales, with anything between 1 billion and 3 to 4 billion neurons, given the size of their cortices and the rules that we know that apply to their closest relatives, which are antelopes and giraffes and hippopotamus. So there we are at 1 to 4 billion neurons. With 1 to 3 billion neurons, you have baboons with 2 to 3. You have monkeys with about 1 to 2 billion neurons. You also have macaws with 2 to 3 billion neurons. Crows, which are really smart creatures, they're almost there, but they don't make it to 1 billion neurons, right? And everybody else has fewer than 1 billion neurons in the cortex. So see, that tells you already what we know about all these species that I just ranked to you. What we know about them makes us very comfortable to qualify these species as the smart ones, which, in a very interesting and amusing twist, means that once you have data to infer that T-Rex had 2 to 3 billion neurons in its telencephalon, in its cortex, regardless of how large it was, then the natural implication is that it must have been as smart as a baboon is these days, which is absolutely terrifying. Come on.
Yeah, and very counterintuitive.
And it got a lot of pushback from both paleontologists, specialists, and armchair specialists who would still argue that in Jerrison style, but those animals were gigantic. If they were gigantic, didn't they need all those neurons to run their bodies? Which brings us to that other assumption right back there in the beginning of the story of where did we go wrong in our assumptions. So that was assumption number one, actually, that bigger animals need more neurons to run their bodies. Let me put it this way. If you ask a biologist or if you ask a neuroscientist or a paleontologist, apparently, do you need more neurons to run a bigger body? They would say, of course, yes. Of course you do. There's going to be more muscle. There's going to be more skin, right? There's going to be more stuff to run. So it should take more neurons. Now, the fun thing is, and I've had my share of this fun talk, asking this question to every single engineer, especially biomedical engineers I run into, and ask them, do you need more controlling units to operate a bigger body? And their answer is, what? Of course you don't. If the body, if you're not changing the shape of the body, if you're not changing the number of joints, if you're not changing the degrees of freedom of movement, of action, then you can run a tiny little human-shaped robot, kid-sized one, and a T-Rex sized human-shaped robot with exactly the same number of controlling units, right?
And so would it be right to kind of take stock of where we are in that? When we just focus on the cortex and we do your brain soup method and we actually get a pretty accurate number of how many neurons do we have, we find that yes, bigger animals tend to have more, but it's nowhere nearly as linear of a relationship as you might want to have. In the close to 1 billion or more, you have everything from whales to crows, tiny birds and huge mammals, etc.
So here's what you have to add to that statement to make it true. Now, a given number of neurons may occur in a tiny little brain that's extremely neuron dense.
Like the crow.
Exactly. And it can also occur in a much, much bigger brain, like a giraffe brain, about the size of your two hands together, which is much less dense. All animals are not apples. There are apples, there are oranges, there are all different types of fruit out there. And so as long as once you know that you're comparing apples to apples, provided that you're comparing, say, primates to primates, it is true that the bigger the brain is, the more neurons it has in a highly predictable manner, right?
I think one of the fascinating things about this is that when we say things like, well, human brain is not special, yeah, it has a lot of neurons, the cortex has more neurons than any other brain, but that it fits on these graphs. I think some people might say, oh, but that sounds like, at the end of the day, you can always find a graph to fit anything, but it really isn't so. And I think elephants would be a good example of that, because you find that when you don't look at the cortex, am I right, that when you include the whole brain, the elephants actually have more neurons than humans, and a huge amount of them is in the cerebellum.
Correct.
Which for me is pretty mysterious. And I love this anecdote, this fact that if you want to share a theory of why on earth do elephants have so many neurons in their cerebellum, please do. But before that, I just want to highlight that, am I interpreting it right in saying that there is a way in which the elephant brain really is special? It's like a very weird, unique brain that you wouldn't really predict it to have that kind of a brain. And humans are not like that. We are just what you would predict a primate to have.
So let me start by saying this. In all of these species that my collaborators and I have been able to look at, I find it hilarious that the one species that everybody always expected to be an outlier has never turned out to be an outlier in any way, shape, or form, and that's our species. That's humans.
We always fit the graph.
Yeah, we always fit the graph. We're always on the line. But you do find outliers, and the outliers are extremely remarkable in how much of an outlier they are. I'll give you three that are outliers in completely different directions. Let's start with the elephant that has, so the fact, the number is the elephant cerebellum has 12 times the number of neurons that you would expect it to have for the number of neurons that you find in its cortex. 12 times. So it's not a little bit of an outlier.
Overall, human brains, you say around 86 billion neurons. Overall, the elephant brain was around how many?
257, I think.
Okay, so over twice as much as humans.
Yeah, but 98% of those neurons are in the cerebellum. And let me qualify this. In most other mammals, what we find is that regardless, whatever the size of the cortex or the size of the cerebellum, you find that the cortex has about 20% of all neurons, of all brain neurons, and the cerebellum has about 80%. And yes, that adds up to nearly 100%, which goes to show how few neurons you find in the trunk of the brain. So 20% cortex, 80% cerebellum. In the elephant, it is 98% of all those neurons in the cerebellum, right? Which begs the question, how come?
Do we know enough about cerebellum to really know? Because, I mean, there is the mystery answer, which is to say we will never know. And this just shows that elephants are incredibly unique in a way that we will never know. What do we know about the cerebellum?
The hypothesis is that elephants have that many neurons in the cerebellum because there is this massive part of the body that brings massive sensory inputs to the cerebellum that no other animal has, and that is 100 kilograms, 200 pounds of trunk. So a trunk, the elephant trunk, is this highly organized mass of muscle and nerve endings. So it's this highly motile, but also highly sensitive structure. Also, just like the arms of an octopus, because it doesn't have joints, because it doesn't have bones, it has infinite degrees of freedom. So it can turn, right? It can turn in all these interesting ways. So the point is, there's a lot of signal that comes and goes from to and from the trunk, but there's also this gigantic number of neurons that innervate the trunk and that send on their signals to the cerebellum. So does it mean that the elephant needs a large cerebellum? No, I would say rather the other way around, that everybody generates excess neurons in their brains as they develop. How many neurons you keep is something else, is a matter of how many neurons find something to do, right? How many neurons find targets. And when you have this massive trunk, it just follows that the cerebellum, the neurons in the cerebellum are going to find much more to connect to. And therefore, you have opportunity for many more neurons to survive in the cerebellum of the elephant than you find in any species.
Fascinating. Yeah, you said you had three exceptions to keep. Let's keep it relatively short, but I would love to hear them. So please go ahead.
So the other one is going the opposite direction. You have the brown bear, and true. We only have the one brown bear specimen so far, just like we only had the one elephant brain to work with so far. I think the reasons are obvious and very fortunate, right? We should not have tons of elephants or brown bears to work with. But anyway, the rest of the animal, the findings with the rest of the animals are so incredibly consistent that when you have this one animal that is such a massive outlier, it really stands out. So the brown bear stands out in that it also has many more neurons in the cerebellum relative to what it has in the cortex. But in the case of the brown bear, it's pretty straightforward to show that it's not because the cerebellum has more neurons than it should have, but rather that it's the cerebral cortex. It's missing a very large number of neurons. How come? I think there's a very, very likely answer, which is there is not enough energy to keep up all those neurons.
So same as with the great apes.
Same as with the great apes. And the evidence in the case of the brown bear is these are animals that hibernate for 6 months of the year. Hibernation is not optional. It's not a luxury. Hibernation is your body realizing, acknowledging that I'm out of energy. Things are going to look really, really bad from here on. So just shut everything down until environmental temperatures go back up.
Yeah.
The third is the raccoon. And the raccoon is an outlier in a really cool way because every single part of the raccoon brain has twice the number of neurons that you would predict in a carnivorous brain of its size.
Okay.
It's like, do you know how in animal evolution, every so often there's a doubling of the entire genome, which gives you new opportunities? It's like the entire raccoon brain underwent a doubling of neurons.
Any speculations on why?
I think it just happened. And the consequence is that you have this creature that is fairly small. It has a fairly small brain, but it has twice the number of neurons that you would expect. Incidentally, those numbers put the raccoon on par with primates.
Really?
If you gave me the numbers for a raccoon and didn't tell me what it was, I would tell you, oh, what a cool primate brain. But it's not a primate, it's a raccoon, right? And that makes perfect sense, of course, with all the anecdotes of how smart these creatures are.
This is such a nice angle to the humans are, yes, remarkable, but not special, is that they are animals that are special. They are things where you really wouldn't see it coming. And in humans, we fit
Right.
on that line of being a primate of our size. And we were able to fit that line because we cook.
Exactly. So that's a very good point. It's not that there aren't any outliers out there. There are outliers. It's just that we're not one of them. And it's okay. That's not demeaning in any way. That doesn't mean that doesn't make us any less because we're not out of the ordinary. We're not extraordinary. We're not exceptions. We're just another primate. But yes, we happen to be that one primate that managed to come up with the cheat that gave itself the opportunities to have this enormous number of neurons, of cortical neurons that, yes, nobody else has. I like to say that in one word, my big scientific interest is diversity, life diversity as a whole, but brain diversity in particular. And how that diversity came about is evolution. Evolution is the story of changes, not improvement, very important, not improvement, simply change over geological time, right? So my main interest is studying diversity, and there are 3 axes, let's say, of I'm interested in, of what I focus on studying about diversity. One is what's the extent of diversity? In this case, how different can things be? How different can brains be? Number 2, what are the constraints to that diversity? So what are the boundaries? Where can you not go beyond, right? And third thing, so what? So what that you have a brain that is this big or this small, and so what that there are that these certain constraints exist, right? And it's been really rewarding. I mean, really immensely satisfying that by expanding our data set, by cataloging that diversity, you have enough information, you have enough data points. I love data. You have enough data points that you can start really appreciating all those things at the same time. What's the extent of diversity? What are the boundaries to that diversity, if any? And what comes with that diversity? So things like how much energy it takes to run a body with a certain brain size, with a certain number of neurons. How long does an animal live, depending on how many neurons it has? Turns out that longevity, which was long assumed to be a function of how big the body is, because the bigger the body is, the more slowly it uses energy. So supposedly, the more slowly it accumulates damages related to metabolism. So therefore, the longer the animal should live. Turns out that body size only explains about 20 to 30% of maximal longevity across warm-blooded species.
I was just going to ask if this is only for warm-blooded, because of the very long-living lizards.
So here's the thing. A similar relationship, turns out, also applies to the cold-blooded species.
Okay.
It's just that because they function at a different temperature,
They can live longer.
They live longer, right? But let's stick to warm-blooded species. It turns out that the size of the body only accounts or only explains about 20 to 30% of the variation in maximal longevity. And I could show that even that 20 to 30% is actually a mathematical byproduct of the fact that, to some degree, larger animals tend to have more neurons in their cortex, because the actual predictor, the best mathematical predictor of longevity across warm-blooded species, is very simply how many neurons they have in their cortex. How come? That is something that I hope that I'll have an answer for you in the next 5 years or so. But the point is, whatever gives an animal more neurons in the cortex also slows down their pace of life, slows down their growth, and allows them to live longer lives. And number of neurons in the cortex, this variation in number of neurons in the cortex it explains 72% of variation in maximal longevity, which in biology is unheard of.
Wow.
So once you realize that the best predictor of longevity amongst warm-blooded animals is simply how many neurons they have in the cortex, when you plot that graph, when you compare different species, humans included, what do you find? That humans are not at all an exception, which is very important, because the story of human evolution has also been told as not only the story of encephalization, of increasing encephalization, but also as the story of selection for a longer childhood and longer lifespan. Grandmother hypotheses.
I mean, I've had Kristen Hawkes actually on the podcast. That's episode 6 for those who want to listen to it. Yeah.
Right. So that's the idea that humans would have evolved much longer lives than expected for the size of our bodies, because of the selective advantage of hanging out with your grandparents, more specifically hanging out with your grandmother, who could then be your big source of nutrition, but also safety and education, right? But here's the thing. You only need this explanation if it's really true that human longevity is an outlier.
Yes, and you're saying that it's not. Yeah.
It's not an outlier. So if you had a generic warm-blooded vertebrate, it doesn't need to be a primate, it doesn't need to be a mammal,
Yeah.
it could be a bird. If you had a warm-blooded vertebrate with 16 billion neurons in the cortex, like we ballpark have, you would predict that species to live a life of 90 something years.
Yeah.
That's us.
That's fascinating.
You would also expect that species to only reach sexual maturity about 12 years after birth.
That's us.
That's also us.
Whoa.
Regardless of the size of the body. See?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. That 72% means that if you tell me the number of neurons in the cortex of a warm-blooded species, I can predict with 72% of certainty how long that species lives. And our species is on the dot. It's on the line. We are that generic primate, that we are that generic warm-blooded vertebrate.
And I think here, by the way, one very important thing is that we discussed this with Kristen Hawkes, is that a lot of skeptics say, well, hold on a second, 90 is just with modern medicine and whatever. And just to be clear, you're not saying that that's the average lifespan, that's the maximal lifespan.
Absolutely. And notice how it doesn't matter how well you treat a mouse. It doesn't matter how
much modern medicine.
It doesn't matter the amount of medicine you give a mouse. You will not see a mouse that lives past 2 years of age or so. But that is our story. And with that large number of neurons that we could afford, thanks to this opportunity that our ancestors gave themselves, along with that comes a slower pace of life, a longer childhood, which means that you have more time to develop your skills. You have more time to learn from your peers. You have more time to observe your parents. You have more time to listen to stories that are going to be told not only by your parents, but also by your grandparents. Because guess what? The same thing that gave you more cognitive capabilities and a longer childhood also allowed the adults of your species to live longer lives.
Okay, well, before we finish, a final question that I always ask guests. All of the research, all of the reading and thinking that you've done around our primate nature, how has it shaped your outlook on our species?
I'm only more and more aware that we are just another animal out there, really, albeit one that with all these neurons, we have a very long life, which allows us to build a huge body of culture that we keep alive by passing it on to the next generations. But what I wish people were more aware of is that cultural transfer, that keeping humanity alive, is active. It's something that needs to be actively done every generation anew. And that takes schools, that takes universities, that takes education and training. It takes effort. It's not, again, there's no free lunch. So it takes the effort. And if people are not willing to put in the effort, our species may very well just die out. Like we know that so many other species died out, especially, and here's the kicker, I guess. We know that the bigger a species is, the more likely it is to become extinct. We're there. We're that species that's pretty big, that postpones as the longest its reproduction. And the things that we treasure in our modern world, they're hard earned. They're not biology. They're the consequence of our use of the biology that we inherit through this active transferring of knowledge and technology and values that build a culture. And that takes effort. And we need to acknowledge that it takes effort. It's not enough to have a human biology. Human nature comes with the effort that we put into it.
Professor Suzana Herculano-Houzel, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Great talking to you.
Okay, so that was it for today. That was the very simple story of the human brain as told by one of the leading neuroscientists of today, Suzana Herculano-Houzel. Next week, you're gonna hear a more complicated story about the evolution of the human brain from another leading scientist, Dean Falk. Stay tuned. And if you want to do a little act of support, you can subscribe to the show, you can rate the show, you can share the show, and of course you can join the wonderful group of people at patreon.com/onhumans. All of these things really do help, and your attention today really means a lot. So thank you so much, and until next time, take care.